I'm Randy Reed, Executive Director of the National Lighting Bureau, and we are here for the 8th Annual Lighting Forum. I'm joined by Lisa Heschong, author of The Visual Delight in Architecture, Terry McGowan, representing the International Dark Sky Association and the American Lighting Association, and Nancy Clanton of Clanton Associates. The name of this panel is Visual Light. So Lisa, the first question is to you. How are window views a different concern than daylight illumination inside of buildings?
We've all been taught to think about the illumination inside of a space, but I began to realize that what people are looking at in the space is the view. And how much time they spend looking at the view has a lot to do with how much illumination they receive at the eye, how bright their visual environment is. The more interesting the view, the more they look at it, the more light information they get from that view. And so designing our environments that support that activity is really important. It's another way to think about visual quality. It's another way to think about trying to get the right balance of visual information inside of a space as opposed to just illumination levels.
What is involved in doing a lighting design with windows, such as where the desk is located and whether someone's back is to the window or against the window? I never realized it was that detailed.
Good question. I would love that lighting designers had input on where people sit and what they are looking at in the rest of their environment. Generally, they don't. But because looking out a window is one of the most important things that we do in a space visually, you want to make that easy for people, but they can glance sideways easily. You don't have to be looking directly at the window. If your primary task is working on a computer, like for me right now, you want to be able to look at the computer without the brightness of the window in your field of view. So the view can be off to the side. Right now, I've got two windows directly opposite me. That's why my face looks nicely lit the way that it does. And with natural color and illumination, because that's all coming through my window. But I can easily glance out either window and still keep my attention on the computer. So that's the kind of spatial balance that you want to try to create in a space. And in general, if you have the opportunity, having light come from two sides, having daylight come from two sides really helps to balance the light in the space, if there's any opportunity for that. There's a lot of tricks to try to improve that balance relative to what the light that's coming in through a window.
Yeah, Randy, we have been exploring developing criteria for at least commercial buildings and views and windows. And there's some excellent criteria already written in Europe. And it's EN 17037, getting real techie. And what that does, it looks at what you're looking at out the window and the different layers. Is it the ground layer, the vertical layer, the sky layer, and how far those layers are? And it also takes into account your angle of where you are in the space. And we're testing it out in several universities, and it's turning out to be remarkably good, this particular standard. And so again, we want to be able to give line designers some tools and or architects, whoever's making this decision, working together and where you place people in a space.
Well, you mentioned angle, okay? Does it look at things like eye health or age of the worker?
The standard doesn't. It basically is saying the angle of what size window you have and where is it located compared to where you're sitting. So I know Lisa can go into the eye health and
okay, but let me ask you, Nancy, you use the word standard, not a recommended practice, not a guideline, but a standard in Europe.
Yes, correct. It's a standard in Europe. And that's adopted by individual countries. And it is, like I mentioned, we are testing it out. Dr. Koga in Kyoto, Japan, is getting her graduate students to test it out. And she said it's remarkably good, this particular standard. And we'd love to bring it to the international field. I'm working on ISO and developing a daylighting standard for the world on this. And that's going to be part of it.
Daylighting and view.
And view, yes, thank you. No, and view is going to be definitely part of it. And we're going to incorporate that view standard into the recommendations.
Okay, Lisa, you got to help me out. I think I know what you mean by view, but specifically, why did you chime in and emphasize view? Why is that important?
Well, again, it's distinguishing between measuring the illumination that's inside of the space versus the information that's coming from that view of a window, right? And there's so much more involved cognitively in terms of our reaction to the information that's coming through the view. It's very important to think about that. Just so, for example, Nancy was talking about angle of view. There's evidence that being able to see the horizon is very important cognitively. It helps us orient our balance, but it also helps us sort of motivate future actions and understand our relationship to the outer world, where and when we are in space. And therefore, having a more continuous horizon with a wider angle view rather than very narrow segments seems to be helpful to people.
I saw a Frank Lloyd Wright house a couple of weeks ago. There's one locally, and they had a tour, so I went. And what you've both been saying, Lisa and Nancy, is exactly what I saw in this house. It was built in the 1950s, but each room had a view. It didn't matter what that view was as much as the fact that you could walk into that room and feel yourself being taken outside. And of course, Frank Lloyd Wright used a lot of big windows too. So right away, I got this idea that, a window in a wall is not much of a daylight. What you really need is a daylight experience that really encompasses the body and the soul, not just something that you can look through like a porthole. It has to be there in a way that will affect you, not just from a lighting standpoint, but from psychologically. And I think Frank Lloyd Wright was a master at doing that, of course, because he was able to take that daylight and not only provide the view, but indirect lighting as well as direct lighting. And that notion that you mentioned just a few minutes ago about layers of light, well, that's something that I think any residential lighting design person today needs to take into account if they are going to make a successful space.
Yeah, and also carrying, a little bit further, one of your previous questions of how do we bring this into our design? I have been kind of surveying university students when I teach a remote class. And I've said, how did you pick your work spot? It's COVID and all that. We're all working at home. Did you do it because of best acoustics, thermal comfort, best desk, daylight and views? What is it? Acoustics come up number one, especially if they have dogs or whatever. But view and daylight are definitely two. And then I have them take a picture of it. And the few that can't stand it are the ones that are stuck in dorm rooms with the brick wall or the concrete wall a few feet away. They go, I feel like I'm in prison. I'm going crazy. And I'm going, what if we take that experience and move it into our commercial buildings and into our homes? That everyone needs a view.
That's a great point.
That would make much of the lighting we have today much more successful.
Yes, in combining it no longer, and the equity of views too. It's not just the CEO of a company as the window view or the corner office. Everybody has it. Yes. And that we design our buildings for that equity of view. Because like Lisa said, oh, cognitive, it's so important for us to have that view.
There
I
are
like that phrase, equity of view.
there are a lot of studies about light and health and circadian stimulus, but I've never thought about a study with people that have views. Have there ever been studies on the effect of a view that you know of?
The earliest studies were done in the 1980s by Roger Ulrich. They're quite famous. And he was studying people in hospitals and found that people in hospitals with view recovered faster and used less pain medication. So that really was very provocative, and it's still held after all these years. In the early 2000s, I was publishing my studies looking at the impact of daylight on student performance, on office worker performance. But as I was controlling for view as a potential confounding factor, I found that view was actually as important in terms of results and consistently more significant in every way that I tested it, that having a better view for students predicted better outcomes, it predicted better cognitive performance in office workers, and it was very, very consistent. And so that really set me off on this path. Just very recently, Won-Hee Ko at UC Berkeley did a study comparing office workers in the exact same room with and without a view and found better cognitive performance. Interestingly, she also found that they were more thermally comfortable. They were happier. They had happier thoughts. And so she looked at a lot of different outcomes, and view just came through consistently positive on every outcome that she's looked at, that other people have looked at.
Okay, so Lisa, what about needing light from more than one side? Why does that matter?
If you just put a single light bulb in the middle of your room, you have a lot of shadows. But we tend to balance that with multiple lamps or with light shining on the wall. One of the most important things that I learned early in lighting design was put the light on the stuff you want to look at, right? That's where you want the highlight. That's what people will look at. Well, the view is what people look at. It's the brightest thing. But then having daylight come from another direction, whether it's from a skylight or even from reflected sunlight off of another surface, helps to balance the light so that you don't have really deep shadows and strong contrast. And it works beautifully. Daylight is naturally self-balancing. It all, goes up and down together. It's a great system. Mother Nature was really smart.
And Randy, you mentioned circadian cycle.
Yes,
I
yes.
think that our focus so recently has been on electric light and its role in circadian, which, yes, in the evening, I completely agree, get rid of blue light. But during the day, why don't we look at the presence of daylight in the views, and how often do you look outside? I mean, even since I've been talking, I've looked outside a whole bunch. I'm looking at these beautiful mountains and how that really helps our circadian rhythm, and not rely upon what I call the blue light pill. We need to really look outside, provide those views, those opportunities for everybody.
I mean, what I've been trying to say is that looking at a view is easily an order of magnitude more powerful in terms of circadian stimulus than any electric lighting source you're going to have in your space. So I've listened to these other programs talking about lighting and health and how to get all the engineering just right to get the right circadian stimulus, but it's not a problem if you have a view. It just works, right? You don't have to engineer it.
That's exactly right. And I put some numbers on it the other day, in fact, that roughly it takes 350 lux in your eye. This is not on your work plane. This is in your eye for an hour or so to train circadian rhythm. Now, doing that electrically can be done, and there's going to be sophisticated designs of candle power distribution from luminaires that will do that for us at some point. But why not use daylighting for that? It's in the right position. You can control it. It's free. It comes every day, and it does the job. This just makes so much sense that if we're serious about circadian rhythms, that daylight has to be one of the major players.
Yes, and Terry, and the electric light, when we've done that circadian lighting with the electric light, people go, oh, it's so bright. They're not looking, they don't want to look at it. Where a window, oh, beautiful. I'm looking out my window. And so all of a sudden we're getting that circadian rhythm by something we want to look at and not something we look at as too glaring.
So, Lisa, in preparing for this meeting, you were gracious to send me some notes, and you did talk about, as you mentioned, the cognitive performance and less mind wandering. Now, that seems counterintuitive to me. If I have a great big window, I think my mind is going to wander more. Is that not what the studies show?
No, the studies do show your mind wanders more, but there are good outcomes from that. Mind wandering done well is a source of creativity. It's a source of problem solving. It's how we plan for the future. It's how we make sense of our past. And what neurologists have recently learned is that the brain is sort of alternating back and forth in a very rhythmic pattern between outward directed tasks, doing what you're supposed to be doing, and inward directed autobiographical sensing and thinking. What's happening with me right now? Am I cold? Am I hungry? Am I uncomfortable? Do I need to plan for my son's birthday? All of these personal items are being processed mostly unconsciously while we're mind wandering, and then we get back to task. And the brain is sort of switching back and forth continuously between these two. So having a view that engages us helps that mind wandering to be more successful. Anyway, that's my hypothesis, and I think it's very important to realize that we have psychologically focused so much on task performance as opposed to focusing on human performance and development and what the individual needs, and the individual needs that view.
Yeah, the more we mind wander, the healthier we are. Like Lisa said, the more creative. I find myself doing it. Like I'll just be working on something and then I'll just look out the window and I go, oh, I'm relaxing. Did I just, I kind of running other things through my mind. That's not distraction or daydreaming. It is important for our mental health to have that time of mind wandering. And views provide the best mind wandering environment for us.
Well, let's get rid of the term task lighting.
Yeah.
Lighting is for people, folks. That's the only reason that lighting is important to people. It is the way we live. It is not the task that we see. It is surrounding us, and it is part of our lives, and it's part of the health requirements. Let's broaden that out. Let's get rid of task lighting and say lighting is for people.
And you know what? It's interesting because we do a lot of work up in the Nordic countries, way, way up north. To them, they're so starved for daylight in the wintertime. And we go, oh, don't have direct sun come into your building or thing. They go, yes, any direct sun, we want it. And so culturally, of where you are in the time of season, we need to understand, let's provide it for people because they need it.
One of my favorite websites right now is Through My Window. And what it is people posting pictures of what they see through their windows. And this comes from all over the world. And some of the pictures are through car windows, others are through the window next door and so forth. But this little website started up, and already it has 65,000 people signed up for it. And it is now the source of more gorgeous ideas about what your window should be like and what it should do and what it can do. than I've ever experienced before. It's a visual delight. And so absolutely, view and windows makes life much better. I really agree with Lisa on that.
Nancy, is it your opinion that lighting designers have the tools they need for this, to do the daylighting with views? Do they have those tools?
I would probably say yes, but they don't know it. In other words, if they took windows and views as seriously as they did the electric lighting and balancing it, because so often light designers are just given a plan and say, design the electric lighting. They're not involved in the daylighting. If we can get all line designers to be so engaged in helping architects in the balance of windows and where we do it together. Yes, all lighting, light is light. You know, we can't distinguish of what it is. And Lisa's an architect. I'm an engineer. So Lisa, how would you say we could bring this in?
Well, it just occurred to me that you would never ask a heating and cooling engineer to design the heating and cooling system of a building without knowing where it was, right? That the influence of climate is what you are responding to, right? So if it's too hot, you're providing cooling. If it's too cold, you're providing heating. In the same way, a lighting designer should never design without understanding what the daylighting contribution is in the space. That's what you're responding to. That's your climate. That's your context, right? And so the daylighting comes first, and then the electric lighting becomes supplemental to it. So if it's the corner is too dark, or if this picture needs a spotlight, you understand how that changes. It's dynamic. Of course, that is a lot harder than designing as if it were nighttime, right? So most electric lighting designers have been taught to design as if it's night, and then you're lighting the space with no contribution from the windows, so that it's sufficient, right? You don't have to depend on the daylight. So unreliable, that daylight. I just don't know what to do with it. But if instead lighting designers understood that the daylight is the climate in which you are working, then respond to that. I think that would be liberating to everyone involved.
Which profession would you say, Lisa, I'll go to you on this, is the most attuned to the need for views? Would it be the engineer, the architect, or the lighting designer? Which profession understands it the best?
Artists.
Artists. Great answer.
Good answer. Good.
Great answer.
Yeah.
Daylighting is first. Daylighting is the primary lighting source. The electric light, like Lisa said, fills in. It fills in the gaps as the sun changes everything. And lighting designers need to understand what the controls and what they're lighting to balance things out, but not to be the predominant and without understanding the daylighting. But, oh, Lisa, you are so right, artists. Oh.
Or another profession are photographers, because they
Yes.
really understand the balance of light and dynamics and fill light and highlights and the mystery of shadows. Shadows are just as important as highlights. And so what we're really doing is we're composing a visual environment with the daylighting balance, but we're also providing this wonderful thing to look at, which I refer to as our circadian snacks, right? So we can go look at the window and get a circadian snack whenever we feel a need for a little boost.
Wrapping up here, how do we move forward?
From my point of view, I want to pull together a lot more information on how view is working psychologically and physically, so that people really understand. There is so much more information that we have not paid enough attention to. So I think there's a lot of progress to be made in that front. But for lighting designers, for homeowners, for building managers, to just think that people really want to look out those windows. They're hugely motivated. They want a view. And once they have it, they will fight. They do not want to give it up once they have it. It's very emotionally important to them. And so accept that and figure out how we can support it as much as possible. How can we make better window coverings? How can we make it easier for people to modulate the light so that they can maintain comfort and the view simultaneously, as opposed to ignoring it? It's been the elephant in the room for too long.
It has been. And, real estate agents haven't figured out, you buy views and, you pay 10 to 15 times more for that property if it's a beautiful view. So what are we missing? When Lisa and I went through the IES guidelines of daylighting, a whole recommended practice on getting daylight into a space, and there are 2 sentences about, it'd be nice to have a view. How do we change the whole focus to focus on views and then fill in with the daylighting?
I think we need to encourage more research on daylighting. And I say that because I work with the McClung Lighting Research Foundation. That's all they do is research lighting. I can't think of any project that we've had that has really done that from a daylighting standpoint. And Lisa, I'm going to nail this on my wall. Daylighting is your visual climate. I think that if we take one thing away from today, that would be what I want to take away is absolutely think of it just like climate. We buy clothes, we set clocks, we go on vacation, we live our lives according to the climate. And the visual climate is very important to human life. I think we ought to make a point of finding out how that works. And
I agree. And I think equity is so important. How we design our buildings and remodel them to make sure everyone gets views.
And then we have this horrific example at UC Santa Barbara where a billionaire decides that those students, those undergraduates, they don't really need a view. It's always somebody else that doesn't really need it. And so he could finance this dormitory where there's 4,600 undergraduate students with no windows. It's just the beginning of the kind of equity challenges that we have. It's not okay.
It's not okay. We all need it.
There was such an outcry. Did that get put on hold? What's the status of that?
We don't know. In fact, I've got a meeting this afternoon with the U.S. Green Building Council and with some of their board members. We don't know. And the biggest tragedy is if this gets LEED certified.
Can't happen, Nancy. Make it not happen.
Well, I'm working every connection I have.
And you are.
And Randy, thank you for going to post our letter in the Edison report too.
Yeah, we want to draw as much attention to it as we can. I was floored by it. I was absolutely floored by it. Closing comments.
Closing comments to me means I want to change the way I think about residential lighting. I do technical support a lot in residential lighting community. And I have been guilty of that. I haven't paid as much attention to daylighting as I should have, even knowing Lisa and what I do know. So I think it's time for a change. And in the future, I think it's going to be easier to change. And I'm thinking now of smart homes and how much easier it would be to incorporate shade control, for example, along with dimming and lighting control. So you have the best balance of daylighting and electric lighting in home spaces. That to me is an opportunity.
Nancy, closing comment.
My closing comment is I think every single building needs to have wonderful views. And even though the energy side of it, like, windows, it's so energy efficient, we need to move away from the energy of a building to the health of the people. And it can be a win-win situation.
Lisa, closing comment.
My closing comment is that we spend 90% of our lives inside of buildings. And even though we know that spending more time outside is really good for you and really, really healthy. The next step is making your interior environment as healthy as possible. And daylight and view are an essential component of that for everybody. And most important, where they spend the most of their day, right? So if they spend the daytime working, that's where it matters. If they spend the daytime in school, that's where it matters. If they spend the daytime in the kitchen, that's where it matters. So let's keep that in mind.
And I have a closing comment. I have done many of these throughout the last decade, and many of them have discussed daylighting. It's the first time we've ever discussed view. So thank you for opening my eyes to that. And Lisa, I can't wait to read your book.
And while we are waiting on questions, I want to ask a follow-up question. Nancy, you mentioned we talked about this building and you are about to go to a meeting on that building with no windows. Do you have any new information to share?
Not yet. It's really taking action, and that's the good thing. You know, I wish I could share more, but it's kind of under confidence. But I think things are happening from all directions, but we don't know. We don't know what's going to happen.
And also just kind of like to ask the panel, and Lisa, maybe you start with this one, kind of about the future. How do you see the future?
That's a big question. And I think that there are many things that need to be done. We're trying to dig deeper into the biology of how our bodies react to light. There are a lot more surprises out there than those that we've been dealing with for the last 20 years in terms of circadian influences. It's going to get more complicated. My hunch is that we will start designing sun spaces and winter gardens and atriums to be a more common part of our buildings, so that even when the weather is inclement, people can go and get a big dose of daylight and sun based on the biology. It may change the way that we design windows. It may change the way that we analyze the performance of windows. Right now, all of our metrics are based on an efficiency between lumens, defined as visual stimulus, and watts, right? So if there are additional stimuli beyond the visual stimuli, we may need to change those performance metrics, which actually have very big impacts running down through the whole glazing industry, building performance industry, all of our energy performance metrics, all of our codes and standards, all of that kind of rumbles out. So there are big consequences. And I sort of hope that this is a heads up that there's more to pay attention to there, and that we need to expand our scope a little bit.
Well, that leads into our first question. I will just read it off. Where do skylights play a role in this, especially when it's difficult to incorporate vertical fenestration? Are glass skylights better than prismatic skylights?
I would be very happy to answer that. I've spent decades working on skylights, and skylights are an enormously efficient way to introduce daylighting into buildings for many, many reasons. They pull light direct from the top of the sky, which is the brightest, and they pull it into the center of a space, in the center of a building, and they diffuse it broadly. In that sense, I generally advocate for prismatic skylights over clear skylights because they do a much better job of diffusing the light and using it more efficiently. People don't go around looking up at the sky very much. What we need is just that light coming down. So diffusion becomes very important from skylights. They can hugely help to balance those contrast ratios I was talking about earlier. So by bringing daylight in from one direction, they make the view windows that much more effective and that much more comfortable. And some of the absolute best daylit spaces I've seen combine view windows with skylighting, if that's a geometric option.
So my question was about the term banning the term task lighting, but I was thinking of it alternatively as a means of, everything doesn't need to be so bright. You should put appropriate light levels where you need them and provide relief where you don't. So as long as the variance doesn't lead to glare. So I think if you think of the term task as this is where we really need to punch it up, or have it be able to turn on and off as needed, I think it's actually a useful kind of tool.
So Jeremy, I've got an alternative to you. What about calling it personal lighting?
Certainly. Yep.
So that way, if you need it for a task, but if you need it for an ambience, you need it for seeing something. In other words, you can design every person the lighting environment, the personal lighting that that person needs. I've been moving more towards that versus task lighting. So just an idea.
So Terry, what are your thoughts about that? Do you like the term personal lighting?
I do. And I think we're getting closer to really what the future is going to have, because one thing about lighting over the years is that it has been so task oriented, hence the name, of course. But we're getting away from that. And we know psychologically, medically, all of these reasons have been building up for some time. And yet our standards have not changed, particularly in North America. The IS standards really don't take this into account. So to me, the future of lighting is really going to involve changing those standards to something more useful, something more personal, something more people-oriented, so that we can begin to use lighting in new ways and take advantage of not just the architecture, but where we are in latitude and longitude, time of day, and so forth. And we're getting so much information now from the light and health people about circadian rhythms and other things that affect our health, that we have to include that as part of our recommendations. But again, we don't have standards to do that yet. And so to me, going back to your question, the future of lighting is going to be a reinvention of the standards. And I know that some have already thought about this. Dr. Mark Ray from the Light and Health Research Center has written a book about it, in fact. And so we need to get on with that task if we're going to have a successful future, not only for the lighting industry, but for the people that industry serves.
To follow up with that, I know a lot of people have asked during the chat and everything about the role of lighting designers, and you have too. I think lighting designers need to be educated, challenged to work with architects at the very beginning. One of the chats came through saying, yeah, we're, lighting designers come at the tail end of a project. We need to be in at the beginning of a project.
Nancy, you mentioned that mind wandering is important for mental health. Do you think the typical decision maker understands that?
I'll leave that to Lisa.
The average decision maker and CEO understands absolutely the importance of the corner office for their mind wandering. What has been less obvious is that all employees will benefit from that opportunity. If we think in terms of work-life balance, letting people have a more holistic experience while they're at work will contribute to overall productivity, I would argue.
So I joined a little late, but I just wanted to know if you had any opinions about the well light concept.
Yes, I'm a senior advisor to the light concept. I notice other people on this call are also part of it. We're working definitely towards getting daylight and views in it. Right now, the view criteria, kind of, if we're lining it up with EN 17037, the European standard, the daylight or view concept does use Lisa's view level number 3, as a beginning, but it's only 25 feet from the window. I think there's ways we can improve it and really make it a beautiful type of thing. But what I'm hoping is that IES jumps in and really takes some leadership in this. We're doing it in ISO, but collectively, we need to do it all together.
And I would agree that WELL is and LEED are very much a work in progress. They clearly aspire to achieve a good, robust metric that will help guide better design. But we're learning new information constantly, and it's a real struggle to try to understand the science and then translate that into useful design guidance and standards. And I think often the design guides and standards are getting out ahead of the science. It's a tough road to try to balance, but we're all working on trying to advance that.
Lisa and I have been talking about this, but as you see from my background, I'm with the International Dark Sky Association too, and I noticed that healthy
As
light.
are we all.
Yeah,
yes,
we all are.
But that life depends upon bright days and dark nights, and we get the bright days okay, but we don't get the dark nights. And if you look at the headlines from the dark sky people, they're very worried about the fact that people can't see the Milky Way, they can't see the constellations, they can't enjoy the dark the way they do the light. And so I think we have to think about that as we use more daylighting. How can we control that at night so it doesn't escape and just puts us in a very common, dimmy kind of world 24 hours a day? That's wrong too. That's wrong for people, that's wrong for animals, that's wrong for plants. So we have to keep that into consideration, and it is the responsibility of the lighting industry and those in it to make that happen that way.
All right, guys. Thank you, panelists, and thank you, attendees, and look forward to seeing you next week. Same place.
Thank you all.
Thank you, Randy, for hosting this.
Yes, thank
Yeah.
you.